Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, in today's discussion, we are going to talk about language extinction and language death, right? The source material for this discussion or this lecture is the chapter title is Language Death and Revitalization. And this chapter has been taken from the book Living Languages An Introduction to Linguistic Anthropology, right? It's chapter number 12. I'm going to share the link of the chapter with you right in the description of the of this lecture. You may download the book chapter from there for detailed reading. So we are going to talk about language extinction and language death. Remember, so far we have talked about linguistic change. We have talked about the various manifestations and the various effects of language contact when two or more languages come into contact with one another, right? So one of them usually influences another, and that is what we have previously discussed in the previous lectures. Today, we're going to talk about language extension and language death. That languages may die. Also, remember, languages may not only change with the passage of time. We have talked about linguistic changes, contextual changes, and then permanent changes. Also, is in the case of borrowing, right? And then contextual changes are also what we have discussed so far. Today, we are going to talk about this. It's also, you see, kind of permanent linguistic change, right? Linguistic in language extinction and language death. It may be resulted by the influence of a dominant language. I mean, the death of a language may be resulted, you see, from of the influence of a dominant language, or a language may die on its own because of several reasons, which we are going to discuss later on. So, first of all, we'll talk about world languages that and the you see recent statistics regarding endangered languages around the globe. Then we'll talk about the criteria of, you see, or classification of all the languages of the world, how many of them are endangered, and what sort of languages are endangered, what sort of languages are completely safe languages. And then the Krauss's criteria for this classification. Then we'll talk about UNESCO's categories of endangered languages, and then as I said earlier, that there are various reasons. I mean, why do languages die? There are multiple reasons behind that. So we'll talk about those reasons here, right? Or why do languages die? But before that, we'll talk about the, you see, importance of this topic, that why what dies when a language dies, and why should we study language endangerment, right? Then why do languages die? Right here, we'll talk about the various reasons behind language death and language extinction. And also we'll talk about the two types of language death, known as the top-down language death and the bottom-up, right? Finally, we'll talk about the ways out, the possible ways out, that what we can do, what we may possibly do as sociolinguists, and particularly is anthropological linguists, right? How can endangered languages be saved? So that is what we'll talk about at the end. Starting with the statistics of endangered languages around the globe. Um, I hope you know Ethnologue. It's actually kind of online available, we may say, a kind of database it is, which stores the record of all the languages around the globe. I mean, which language is spoken where, in which country, in which region, how many speakers has a particular language got, and you see, I mean, all the statistics and all the information related to a specific language are available on Ethnologue. It's an online available database, remember, right? So according to the Ethnologue results, back in 2016 is mentioned in this book, right? There are 7,097 languages spoken around the globe. But remember, 94% of the total languages, look at these statistics, it's very important, right? 94% of the total world languages, these languages are spoken by and they are used by only the 6% of total population, right? And then the remaining only 6% of all the world languages, right, they are spoken by the remaining 94% of the total population of the world. Now, what can we conclude from these statistics? In simple words, we may say that these 94% of the total languages around the globe, I mean, it's a very high figure, out of 7,097 languages, right? If we take 94% of languages, so there are too many, right? And these languages are spoken only and only by 6% of the total population of the world. And on the other hand, if you look at the remaining 6% languages, only 6% languages are there, right? And these languages are spoken by 94% population, the total population around the globe, right? So by this we mean that these 94% of the world languages, they may be endangered, right? They, with the passage of time, they may get endangered, right? Because they are spoken by only 6% of the total population of the world. The remaining 6% of the total languages, which include, you see, the English language, the Chinese language, and many other dominant languages, right? These languages, remember, they are quite safe languages, and they are actually, it's these languages which are engulfing the rest of the languages around the globe. Like, look at English, for example, right? As we have discussed in the class physically, in the physical classes, that it's actually Americanization, not globalization, because it's American people. Oh, it's you see, the American people want the American language to prevail the world, and the American culture also too. In other words, we may say that the American people actually want a monocultural and monolingual village, right? Where the English language will prevail. That is what they want, right? So these dominant languages of the world are actually they are putting to rest the rest of the world languages, the regional languages, particularly the minority languages, we may say, right? So these statistics show that a number of languages around the globe they are or are going to be endangered in the near future, right? So, according to Krauss, about around, you see, half of the world languages may disappear in the coming 100 years, or in the coming, you see, in the coming century. So that is how this topic is highly important, language extinction and language death, right? Now, coming to the classification of world languages, according to Krauss, all the languages of the world may be classified into four major categories, right? Those four categories, I hope you can see here on the screen. The very first category of world languages he mentions here is safe languages, right? These are those languages which have got 1 lakh speakers minimum, 1 lakh speakers, sorry, yes, 1 lakh speakers, and these languages have got government support or official support. By government support or official support, we mean that they are part of the language policy of a country. I mean, not necessarily a country overall, rather the state, or I mean, whatever the I mean, whatever language planning and policy organization is responsible for that, right? So they have got that, such languages have got that official support or government support. I mean, they are part of the language policy of a state, right? So these languages, according to Krauss, are quite safe and they're not endangered, right? Then the second category he mentions is that of the endangered languages. These are the languages which will cease to be learned in coming in the next century. I mean, people will they will shift to some other languages. We have got this, you see, concept of language shift also. I hope you are already familiar with this term, language shift, right? When people shift from one language into another. We'll talk about language shift right here in the reasons behind language death and extinction, right? So, see, what will happen around the globe if you see a number of people are shifting to the dominant languages of the world. So, what will happen? These languages, the endangered languages, people will start transmitting these languages from one generation to the next generations, because the younger generations will instead start shifting to some other languages. I hope you remember the case of talk, listen, and type also, right? Where the younger generations, they shifted to talk, listen, while elder members of the society, they wanted their kids and younger generations to stick to the type language, right? So that is how you see people may shift with the passage of time to some other languages, and those people then stop learning or acquiring their mother tongue, right? These are the languages which will cease to be learned in the coming century. I mean, people will stop transmitting those languages to the younger generations. Then there are moribund languages. Moribund languages are those languages which are no longer functional, which are, you may say, which are not used in any for any such purposes, such as academic purpose, or you may say any other communicative purpose. They may be used for routine interactions by a very limited of people, but they have ceased to be learned. I mean, people have stopped transmitting these languages to the younger generations, right? Because the younger generations have started shifting to some dominant languages instead. And then the fourth category of world languages he mentions is the dead languages, or extinct languages, right? These are the languages which have died out. I mean, which are no longer used by anyone anywhere, right? They're simply dead languages. Just as human beings die, similarly languages may also die, right? So they are no longer used by anyone anywhere around the globe, and these languages have no existence at all. They may have certain existence in the form of um, you see books. They may be part of written literature, even dictionaries, because they might have been documented also back and past. But since they are no longer used for any purpose, any communicative purpose, so that is why these languages are considered to be dead languages or extinct languages, right? So these are the four categories of or the languages around the globe, and this classification is being proposed by Krauss in 1992. But remember that Krauss has actually based this classification on three criteria. Number one, the intergenerational transmission. As I said earlier, that people transmit languages and along with culture from one generation to the next. Look at your own mother tongue. It was transmitted to you since you were the younger generations, and it was transmitted to you by the previous generations, right? So when this intergeneration transmission stops, right, or it becomes slower as compared to normal or safe languages. So that is how Krauss has decided or determined the various categories of these languages. The second one is the number of speakers, as you discussed here a short while ago, that languages which have got at least 1 lakh speakers, these languages are safe languages. Otherwise, they belong to the rest of the categories. And then the official status or the government support being part of language policy, right? So these are the three criteria which Krauss has based his categorization on. Uh, mm, just like Krauss, UNESCO, I hope you know what does it stand for. United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, right? It's a world organization, and UNESCO has classified or categorized endangered languages into 5 categories, right? The first category, which is not that much endangered, that is vulnerable languages. Then definitely endangered languages. The third category is severely endangered. The fourth one, critically endangered, and the last one, extinct. Right. So from left to right, right from first to start, this categorization shows that the very the category of languages, endangered languages mentioned right here, the very first category. I mean, they are endangered, but not that much, right? I mean, they are still in use somewhere around the globe. Well, the last category being the most endangered one, rather a completely dead language. I mean, so these languages which lie here in the last category of endangered languages, they are dead languages, indeed, right? So this is how UNESCO has also given this categorization of endangered languages. Moving then to the importance of this topic, endangerment, and why should we be careful about endangered languages, and why should we seek to save them, to you see, document, why should we revitalize them, why should we give them a new birth, and it is because the death of a language, the death of a language is not just the death of certain linguistic items. I hope we are familiar with linguistic items, right? We have had a detailed discussion on linguistic items previously. So, as I said earlier, that the death of a language is not the death of certain linguistic items only. Rather, there are a number of other things which also die with along with the death of a language, right? Those factors which die or which are put to risk with endangerment or with the death of language, they include number one, the local ecological language associated with the language dies, right? Knowledge about medicines, world life. If you look at any language, remember, we have had detailed discussions repeatedly on the topic that you see, language and culture, they always go hand in hand. They're never separable, remember, right? So language is not just the combination of certain linguistic items. Rather, a language carries, you see, or in its strain, a lot of knowledge. I mean, knowledge. Look at the Pashto language, let's suppose, or the Chitrali language, right? The Urdu language, the English language, any language around the globe. So, in that language, people have over centuries, right? People have proposed, they have generated, sorry, a lot of knowledge. They have either generated completely new knowledge or they have translated the previously generated knowledge to their own languages, right? So a language consists of, or it carries along with itself a lot of knowledge related to, you see, education, to not scientific knowledge, you see, knowledge related to sports, politics, education, knowledge related to, you see, history, biology, medicines. I mean, almost all the fields of the world, right? So when a language dies, what happens? All that language, all that knowledge, with that language has got along with itself, that language also dies out. Remember, I mean, when a language doesn't exist, so how can the knowledge exist then? Knowledge cannot exist in vacuum. Remember, it exists through language, and it is transmitted through it is generated through language, it is transmitted through language, right? So that knowledge also dies out when a language dies. Remember, the second point is that the loss of the death of a language is actually the loss of cultural heritage, including myths, jokes, wordplay, voicing, poetry, etc. Look at your own mother tongue, that is Pashto, right? We have got hundreds and thousands of myths in Pashto, hundreds and thousands of jokes, wordplay, voicing. Look at the Pashto poetry, the top genre, for example, right? Or the poetry of Ghani Khan, Rahman Baba, and you see hundreds of poets. We have got Baghzada Danish and many other, right? The Urdu language in the same way, the English language, right? So all the languages, remember, they are full of cultural heritage, and when a language dies, oh, the entire cultural heritage also dies out, right? The third point is that the death of a language may lead to a failure of acquiring a full understanding of human cognitive capacities. Remember, you already have discussed syntax in your previous semester, probably. So, uh, if you look at syntactic structures, Chomsky talks about linguistic universals, right? His generative grammar, right? So, every language has got its own unique structures, and those structures are actually a part of human cognition, remember, or cognitive capacities, we may say, or a cognitive or linguistic repertoire, right? So there are certain languages which have got very strange structures. Like we have got the Pashto language, as we have had a discussion on it in you see the physical classes. I hope you remember that languages may be like according to Noam Chomsky's a head position parameter, right? Head position parameter of languages. Languages may either be head first or they may be head last, right? Like English is actually a head first language because if you look at a prepositional phrase, or be that a noun phrase, an adjective phrase, a verbal phrase, even a tense phrase, and a complementizer phrase, in all these phrases, the head word always comes first. Like if you look at prepositional phrases, let's suppose on the table, right? On the table, in the room, right? Look at these prepositions. These prepositions, they always come fast in the English language because English is a head first language. This is a phrase on the table, right? And the head word of this phrase is on the preposition because it's a prepositional phrase. Since it's a prepositional phrase, so the head word must be a preposition, remember. But then there are languages which are head last. English is head first, remember. Languages may be head last. Like if you look at the Urdu language, right? In the Urdu language, we do not say per maize, rather we say maize per, almari may, right? So Urdu, on the other hand, remember, is head last because per, may, right? These are actually prepositions. They are prepositions, but they come after. I mean, they come at the last of the prepositional phrases. Remember, that is why it is said that the Urdu language is head last. But Pashto, on contrary to these languages, Pashto has got a very unique structure. And that is, I believe, Noam Chomsky fails to address here. Uh, let's wait for Azan. Right. So Pashto language, on the other hand, has got a very unique structure regarding the head position parameter. Like Pashto is at first as well as it is at last, right? Uh, let's suppose on the table, right? In the English language, on comes first. In the Urdu language, on the other hand, we say uh, maize par. So par comes last, right? But Pashto, on the other hand, has got a very unique structure, like we say pa, which is actually a proposition, pa, and then we say uh, mais, and then we say bandi. Bandi is also a preposition, right? We may also say pames, we also say mes bandi, but we may say pames bandi. So we have got head first and then head last also, right? I mean, both the structures are here in the Pashto language. Now, coming back to the point, the death of a language is actually a failure of acquiring a full understanding of human cognitive capacities, right? I mean, if the Pashto language dies out, God forbids, let me repeat, God forbids, if this language dies out, what will happen? A complete, you see, human cognitive capacity, its understanding and its acquisition, all these things will also disappear, remember? I mean, people will no longer behaving this sort of acquisition, or this sort of acquired language acquisition ability to acquire this structure. They will definitely have the ability, but since we acquire language from the language we're surrounded by, we get exposed to, and when this language will no longer be there, God forbid, what will happen? People will, I mean, it will definitely be a kind of linguistic loss, remember. And same is the case with this Urania language also, where they have got another strange structure. Languages usually have got a subject-verb structure. The English language has got the subject, verb, object structure. Subject, verb, object. For example, he delivers a lecture daily, right? He delivers a lecture daily. Now, see, Urdu, on the other hand, has got subject, object, verb structure. वो खाना खाता है. So who is the subject, khana is then the object, right? That is the subject object verb structure. right? Subject, object, verb. But Urania, on the other hand, has got a very unique structure, and that is object, verb, subject, completely opposite to the English language, where the object comes first in a sentence, then the verb, and then the subject of the sentence, right? So this is how you see. It's very important to stay focused on endangered languages and to revitalize them, to document them and to revitalize them, right? Um, there is a linguist, an anthropologist, basically, a linguistic anthropologist. He believes that language is the DNA of a culture, and it is the vehicle for the tradition, customs, stories, history, and beliefs of a people. A lost language is a lost culture. I mean, when we lose a language, I mean, when a language dies out, the culture also dies out. Remember, right? Because we have discussed it repeatedly that you see language and culture always go hand in hand. They are never separable. So when a language dies, so does the culture also, remember, right? So another anthropologist believes that the death of a language is the death of a culture. These are the exact words, remember, right? So that is how saving languages and be concerned about endangered languages is really important, right? Now, the question arises that why do languages die? I mean, what are the various reasons behind the death and extinction of languages, right? So here are a few reasons I've mentioned here. The very first reason is that a language dies when all the speakers of that language die, right? This death of all the speakers of a language may either be due to a natural cause, such as earthquake or flood or any other sort of disaster, right? Or kind of disease, or it may be through violence by others. I mean, when a country imposes a war on another country, particularly we're living in this modern era where countries are equipped with, you see, most recent and up-to-date instruments of war, right? So in such situations, when all the speakers of a language die, the language also dies out, remember. The second point is, or the second cause behind the death of a language is that when all the speakers stop transmitting their language to their younger generation, to their children, I mean, as we talked about endangered languages previously, and one of the reasons behind, or one of the criteria which Krauss based his classification on, that was intergeneration transmission, right? So when a generation stops, or when the speakers of a generation stop to transmit their language to the younger generations, what happens then? The language dies out with the passage of time, because people shift to some other language then, and then there is no native speaker left to speak that language, right? So that is why it dies out then. Colonialism is another major reason behind language death. When a country or a nation colonizes another nation, and the colonizers impose and implement their own language and culture there, so the colonized people, because of prestige which is associated with the language of the colonizers, and that is definitely language of the dominant group, right? So that is language of the masters, we may say. So what happens? People then shift to another language, and that is how the regional languages, in such regard, in such cases, may die out. The last reason is that when the speakers relocate for economic or political reasons, if there are, if there is a language which has got a very little number of speakers, right? And those people relocate to, I mean, they shift to some other places for economic purposes or political reasons. Because of political reasons, they shift to some other places, right? They relocate themselves, they completely immigrate to some other places. So what happens? they they start using the language which is used in the place which they have relocated themselves into. So they start using that language, and there comes a time after a few generations that their you see, we may say, indigenous language or their mother tongue, that language usually dies out then, because it is no longer transmitted to the forthcoming generations, right? So these are the various reasons behind language death, right? Language death is that is something very painful and something very tragic, because everyone loves their language. Remember, just as the Pashto nationalists say, "Zaba Jannat the Pashtusarism," right? That is the in the same way exactly. If you look at all the Pakistani people, you and I, all of us, right? So we associate prestige with and indigeneity with the Urdu language, and we all love the Urdu language, right? Even people are, a number of us are ready to sacrifice our own mother tongue for the Urdu language, because that is our national language, right? A kind of we may say a unifying force for all the Pakistani people. So remember, if somebody compels us to stop using our mother tongue, indigenous languages, into shift to some other language, right? And we see our language dying out. So don't you think it will give us pain? It will definitely, I mean, be very painful for all of us. So that is the reason that people sometimes, when they start shifting to some other languages, particularly when it is by force, so they go through certain traumas and very painful and tragic situations, as we see. The case was the same was the case with the Welsh language, right? When they were supposed to stop using their mother tongue, so they were supposed to wear badges. Rather, they were forced. School children even they were forced to wear badges with the caption "Welsh not." I mean, they were forbidden from using their mother tongue, right? That was actually the Welsh language, right? So they went through certain traumatic situations or painful situations, because it was a very painful thing for them, a kind of tragedy it was for them. So that is why sometimes it turns out to be a very painful phenomenon, language death, I mean, right? uh, Language deaths may broadly be divided into two categories: top-down language deaths and bottom-up language deaths. I hope these terms are self-explanatory. You can easily understand them. Top-down, when the you see the language death starts from the top. I mean, from the government, from the official institutions, and then we have got the bottom-up language deaths, when it starts from the people who speak that language, right? So top-down language that means that when a language has no longer official support, and it is still used by people for their routine interactions, right? On the other hand, bottom-up language that is that type of language that when a language still has got official support, it is still part of the language policy of a state, but people of that language, the native speakers of that language, they start shifting to some other language or whatever the case may be, but they actually stop using that language. So that is why that is then called the bottom up language death, right? If we read this, if we read this line, and top down language death, a language stops to be used in official institution, but I mean, it's no longer part of official notifications, media, and you see all these various forums, but is retained in the home for a while. I mean, it is used for routine interactions, right? And bottom up language that, on the other hand, a language stops to be used in the home or in everyday context, but is retained in the official domains, right? So these are the two broad categories of language death, remember. Now, coming to the very last point and the most important one also, can endangered languages be saved? Here arises a question: can endangered languages be saved? And if yes, how can they be saved? I mean, what can we do? What's the way out? What are the possible situations, right, or measures we can do to save a particular language which is about to die, right? There are certain concepts which you need to understand here, and those concepts include number one, language documentation. I'm going to share a separate chapter with you people and two research papers on language documentation for further detailed reading. Language documentation means that when we document a language which is about to die, I mean, when a language has got a very little number of speakers, or when realized, I mean, you and I, people who are interested in language endangerment, or I mean, in this field, people who are interested in this field, or particularly anthropological linguists or linguistic anthropologists, sociolinguists, right? Those who work in the field of language endangerment and language revitalization, language documentation, they realize that a particular language is about to die. I mean, a very limited number of linguistic items are left, or number of speakers at least, right? So what happens then? People then go to those speakers, to the native speakers. They spend time with that, with those speakers of that language when there are a few native speakers left, right? And they make recordings, video recordings, audio recordings. I'm going to share a chapter with you people on this topic, where the author has given a number of methods for language documentations, or tools for language documentation. So they document a language and they give it a written form, right? But remember, the documentation of a language is not sufficient. That alone is not sufficient, because when a language is documented, it becomes a kind of, you see, permanent part of a library, but nobody uses that language then. So we need language revitalization. Language revitalization, in simple words, you may say that to save an endangered language and to transmit it to the forthcoming generations, right? For this purpose, applied linguists or certain government institutions or organizations, you see, they hire anthropological linguists and linguists also, and they give certain incentives also to the people who use that language in order to promote that language, right? And to save that language from dying out. Like they may give certain incentives, either in the form of cash money or some other, you see, benefits may be given to individuals to acquire that language along with its culture, and to start practicing it, to start using that language. So this is how languages may be saved, right? um, if you look at the Hebrew language, which is from a religious perspective, also it is considered to be a very sacred language. Hebrew, it remained out of use for almost 200 years, 2000 years, right? And you see, it was almost, I mean, kind of, but not dead language, but it was highly endangered language. And what happened then? Then you see, the Yiddish language, it was spoken there, right? It was the dominant language there, and the Hebrew language, as I said earlier, that was endangered. I mean, it had got a very limited number of speakers. But what happened when Jews came to Palestine, and you see, they became dominant there, so they started revitalizing this language, and they since it was already documented, but they started revitalizing it, they brought it into use, right? And then there came a time when, you see, Hebrew was spoken by millions of people, and it was the Yiddish language, which was at the verge of death. I mean, which was at risk, which became endangered, right? So this is how endangered languages or dying languages, they may be saved, they may be given a new birth, a new life, right? In this regard, as I said earlier, a number of research tools are used for documenting the languages such as audio recordings or video recordings, diaries, note taking, field work. You see, people go for field work, and even sometimes anthropological linguists and applied linguists, they have to spend years with the native speakers of the language which is about to die, and this is how they then document it and they revitalize it, right? Um, to conclude the discussion, languages may change with the passage of time. They may develop with the passage of time, but they may also die with the passage of time. Right? And a number of people, languages around the globe these days, they are or are going to be endangered, right? And a number of languages also have died out so far. Krauss has classified all the languages of the world into four categories, where the first category consists of languages which are actually safe. Those languages are safe languages, while the last category is the category of dead or extinct languages. And he bases this classification on several criteria, three criteria basically. UNESCO also has given you see five categories of endangered languages, and then as we discussed earlier, what dies when a language dies. So the death of a language is not the death of certain linguistic items, rather it's the death of local ecological knowledge associated with that language. It's the death of an entire culture, an entire civilization, and the death of, or it's rather, you see, we may say the death of a complete understanding of human cognitive capacities. Language is also the DNA of a culture, as I said earlier, and a dead language or a lost language is a lost culture. A dead language is a dead culture, actually. And with the various reasons behind the death of a language, as we discussed, right, including colonialism, or the death of all the speakers of a language, or you see, stopping the intergenerational transmission, etc. These are the various reasons behind language death. And the last one, can endangered languages be saved? So of course they can be saved, right, through various techniques and research studies. So it's all about today's topic. I'm going to share certain materials with you people on language documentation, language revitalization, and it's a must for everyone to go through all those book chapters or such papers which I'm going to share with you, right? Thank you so much. Stay home and stay safe. Allah Hafiz.